Welcome to today's webinar. This is Beth Overmo. I'm a member of the State Bar of South Dakota and the Strategic Plan Coordinator as well. Before we get started, I'd like to just go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. But first, do you or a law student or lawyer you know have a drug or alcohol problem or are struggling with depression or anxiety? Lawyers Concern for Lawyers is a confidential and independent resource for South Dakota lawyers, law students, and their families. Your referral or visit with LCL is strictly confidential and privileged. Call Becky Porter for more information at 605-391-5191. Becky is a member of LCL, and your communications with her are likewise confidential and privileged. So today's presentation will last approximately 1 hour, and you will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat feature of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And thank you to the State Bar and the CLE Committee for their support of today's program. And now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter. Carrie Sanderson is the director for the South Dakota Center for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment. Ms. Sanderson earned her Juris Doctorate and Master of Public Administration degrees from the University of South Dakota. She has worked in private practice and as a federal prosecutor for the United States Attorney's Office, District of South Dakota. In her role with the center, Ms. Sanderson leads the statewide strategic efforts to know about, respond to, and prevent childhood abuse, maltreatment, and trauma. And with that, here is Carrie for today's presentation.
Hello all and welcome. I appreciate your time today and your curiosity in learning how we can come together as a profession to create safety for victims in the courtrooms, as well as understanding the impact of trauma on all parties involved with the court proceedings. Today we have a couple of good objectives. Our goals by the end of this training are to understand the impact of childhood adversity and trauma on all parties, and then also recognizing that trauma-informed practices can be an important tool for how you're able to move through your case management systems, as well as positively impacting the courtroom dynamic and courtroom procedure. I appreciate the introduction, Beth. Again, Carrie Sanderson with the Center for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment, or CPCM. CPCM is a result of a statewide study of child sexual abuse and maltreatment in South Dakota. At the outcome of a 2-year-long legislatively funded task force that was called Jolene's Law Task Force, South Dakota came together with a plan for how we can positively impact the lives of the children who are impacting trauma. That 10-year plan or strategic plan included the pillars of 3 different ideas. First, we must know about what's happening in our state and know about our best practices on how to respond to instances of harm around our children. Second, we can do a better job of how we respond with early intervention to instances of harm against our kiddos, and then also providing resilient communities in a way for children to heal and to overcome any of the potential trauma that may be happening in their life. And then finally, we're going to look at how can we work together to prevent instances of harm against our children. I'm happy to say that we're making great strides in our state, and we are primed for change. Together, multiple different professions are getting to the point of where we're thirsty for knowledge of how we can be better for our community, for our neighbors, for our colleagues, and then also really looking for that understanding of how science-based techniques will allow us to make advancements in our careers and advancements in how we are helping the people around us. Today, I'm going to start the presentation with a self-care moment. Self-care is tough. It's tough for attorneys. It's something that early in my practice I found to be a little bit too, I'll use the word fluffy. I did not respect how important self-care is to creating success, not only in my personal life and daily life, but also success in the courtroom. The picture that you have on your screen is actually so powerful to me. I one time had a mentor when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office say at the end of his career, the one thing I regret most was going home at night and not being present with my children. There was a moment where he had wished he was able to leave the work that he contemplated and dealt with all day at his workspace so that he could be actually in the moment with his children. And so today, as we move through this presentation, I challenge you to take the next 50 minutes or so to be present in the moment, understand how the information that you're getting today can be impactful for you, but also take note of how you may be able to respond in your daily life in a way that allows you to be present with those around you. Having the information about what is happening in your neighborhoods and with your community members will give you the power to make the change. We need to know that child maltreatment is prevalent in South Dakota, and we'll go over some of the statistics that we have available for us and look a bit at some of the gaps in data. But what's important to continue to be mindful about is that once we know about the prevalence of child maltreatment, we're able to make those links between the adversity in childhood and what's happening in our justice systems, and how you as an attorney, your clients are impacted by trauma and adversity that's happened throughout their lifespan. Because then we'll be able to work together to build that resiliency that allows people to move through the trauma, overcome what's happened to them, and be productive and successful members of society. So let's begin with an understanding of what is childhood trauma. A trauma in childhood is an instance, whether it's real or perceived, that overwhelms the child's ability to cope. It means that the child can shut down and is not able to respond in a way that you would typically think an adult could respond to or would be typical of the child's normal actions. And what's important to remember is that one adversity alone may not be at the level of creating trauma. However, repetitive adversity can lead to that trauma. We as attorneys are often not trained on the impact of trauma on our body and what that actually does to a person who's experiencing the traumatic event. In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente implemented an extensive study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study on over 17,000 participants in the California area. These participants were, the majority of them were over the age of 50, primarily Caucasian, and the majority of them held a college education. At the end of the study, the Kaiser Permanente and the CDC came to recognize that there were 3 different major types of adversities occurring in participants' lives: the abuse, neglect, and household challenges. So on the left part of your screen, the 10 different adversities were measured in these participants. And at the end of the study, it was just revealed in such a tremendous way that the majority of participants had adversity, and that adversity, which was one of the 10, again, studied on the left-hand side of your screen, that adversity impacted them well into their life. There was a direct correlation between the negative things happening prior to the age 18 and then negative health outcomes later in life. Now, what we've come to know in the 20 years since that study is that there's additional forms of trauma that also impact the body. As you see here on the screen, you have the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration definition of trauma. And again, it's that repetitive instance of harm that's either emotionally or physically harmful to the kiddo. And what can that look like? That can come in the form of a car accident or an acute trauma. It can come in the form of historical trauma, meaning trauma that has been passed down through generations, whether it's biologically or through culture. We look at kiddos who are living or growing up through war-torn areas. Those are absolutely traumatic experiences, but something I'd like to point out here is natural disaster trauma. And why I lift this up to the group today is because for the past year, we have been experiencing collectively a natural disaster trauma, and that is COVID-19. It's important to pay attention to the impact of natural disaster trauma on a populace because it increases the amount of stress that people are feeling. You may not have necessarily lost a job, or you might not have lost your home, but you could be experiencing additional stressors about not knowing what's going to happen next. Is there going to be a school opening? Is the daycare center going to close down? Is there a food or a toilet paper shortage? And all of a sudden people around you are acting differently than they had acted in the past. And that is frustrating for a lot of people. You may see similar responses after tornadoes, floods, and fires. Natural disaster trauma is something that is important for us to be mindful of because the actions of the people around you may change after the natural disaster. But so what does this mean? If we have studies of adverse childhood experiences and an understanding that trauma can be impactful when it's coming in other forms, why should we pay attention to that? It's because there is a direct correlation between early adversity in childhood and many of societal issues. While many people realize that exposure to adversity in childhood is associated with an increased risk for mental health issues, many are not aware of what it actually does to the body. Unresolved trauma or trauma that has not, a person who's experiencing trauma and hasn't learned appropriate coping mechanisms will have a potential for two negative health impact. Excuse me, let me rephrase that a little bit better. The trauma can impact the person's physical health in two main ways. First, by leading people to engage in risky behavior as a means of coping. And that's where you're going to see an increased use of drug and alcohol, increased risk of risky sexual behaviors, as well as taking behavioral risks that may seem inappropriate, whether it's the way you're driving or the decisions that you're making. The second area that it's important to remember that adversity will impact you is the stress on the body. When we have chronic stress and your body is reacting to that chronic stress, the result is that your body is going to start having stress-related diseases in adulthood. And that can come in the form of cancers and diabetes. It can come in the form of carrying additional weight. It can come in the form of heart disease. And so when we look at the 17,000 participants from that ACE Kaiser Permanente study, what was fascinating is that we could directly correlate a relationship between bad things happening in childhood and adult societal issues that were involved with risky behavior or stressful or stress-related diseases. What does that mean in practical terms? Neurobiology is telling us that literally the way your body is responding and the synapses in your brain is working is impacted by the stress response that your body is showing. And we see that the higher number of ACEs that you have a higher likelihood of attempting suicide, of considering yourself an alcoholic, of missing work due to mental illness. This is the piece that is just absolutely fascinating to me. Adverse effects of trauma may occur immediately, but often they emerge months or even years after the event. A person may not even recognize the connection between events that happened early in life and the effects of the trauma later in life. And so people who are affected in specific ways may be experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that may be coming much later in life. There is an observable impact of trauma on adults. So if you have clients facing IV drug use, alcoholism, suicide, depression, issues with job attendance, domestic violence, you are likely facing a person or dealing with a person who's been impacted on ACEs. A trauma-informed focus is essential for multiple systems because When we are trying to address societal issues of human trafficking, mental illness, suicide, alcohol and drug use, we must be looking at the resiliency built around a person in childhood, and how we as a community and a group of partners and a group of professionals can respond to that person in a way where we can connect to resources and provide the base for healing so that people can become more productive and stronger members of society. If you look at statistics in the state of South Dakota, the Department of Health collected information, and in 2018, 9% of our state reported an ACE score of 5 or more. We're talking about almost 80,000 people who have a higher likelihood of attempting suicide and considering themselves alcoholic. Fascinatingly enough, the CDC tells us that people with an ACE score of 6 or more die nearly 20 years earlier on average than those without ACE scores. And if you want to talk about a financial impact that this could have on our society, let's talk about the people who are accessing our emergency rooms, that are dealing with long-term care issues because of the stress-related diseases directly correlated to adversity in childhood. The CDC estimates that the lifetime cost associated with child maltreatment is approximately $124 billion. The American Academy of Pediatrics has stated that understanding ACEs and adversity in childhood is the #1 public health issue facing society today, and it's the #1 thing we need to be talking about as we are dealing with creating safer neighborhoods, safer families, and safer communities. Again, this is just a primer of the information, but if you are excited about this topic at this point, and you're excited about learning more about the neurobiology behind why people are acting the way they're acting, and learning more about the impact of ACEs, I'll ask Beth if she can hear me now. I'll continue.
Yep, you're back.
Okay. Could you just tell me the last thing you heard? That would be helpful.
Oh gosh.
No problem. What I was trying to share with you is that if this topic is exciting for you, if understanding the direct correlation between adversity in childhood and the lifelong impacts of that trauma, the Third Circuit will be hosting, I believe, in a full 2-hour ACE presentation discussing very specifically this the ACE study done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and that will be on May 14th. I believe it'll be virtual and in person, and associated with young lawyers of young lawyers for South Dakota. So please do pay attention to some more announcements coming about a full ACE presentation occurring in May. But with this background information about why ACEs are so important for us to pay attention to, let's start talking about what that looks like when we're dealing with child abuse and neglect cases, criminal cases against children, and then also talking about the impact of ACEs on defendants and other folks you'll be dealing with in your law practice. Beginning with our abuse and neglect cases. In South Dakota, our child abuse and neglect cases are civil cases. This is important for us to remember because they're found within the civil statutes, and this is also where our mandatory reporter information is found. In our state, we know that abuse and neglect can take one of 4 forms: emotional abuse, and neglect, as in the neglect that the child is facing for the failure to have the child's basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, as well as abandonment. We look at physical abuse and sexual abuse. Now, what's essential for us to remember is that abuse and neglect, being a civil case, is really reflective of the parent, guardian, or caretaker's action. So when we start talking about harms against children, and we look at statistics about abuse and neglect in South Dakota, it's important to be mindful that these numbers reflect substantiated cases where the perpetrator was a parent, guardian, or caretaker. In 2018, the state of South Dakota had a total of 15,500 total referrals for child maltreatment. And of those referrals, approximately 2,200 of them were referred to investigation by Child Protective Services. And of those 2,200, approximately 1,400 cases were substantiated, meaning that there were 1,400 instances where the state of South Dakota concluded that a parent, guardian, or caretaker had harmed a child. And if you see on your screen, what that reflects is that actually the highest percentage of abuse and neglect faced by children within the state of South Dakota that we know about is that neglect piece. Now, another important piece that I want to remind you of here is that these numbers reflect only areas where Child Protective Services has jurisdiction. In South Dakota, CPS has relationship or contract with 5 of the 9 Native nations. So we have at least 4 tribal reservations that are not included within these statistics. I'd like you to pay attention to the number of sexual abuse victims. If any of you work in criminal practice or are associated with multiple different organizations in your community, you may feel that the number of substantiated cases of sexual abuse is very, very low. Well, this reflects back to what constitutes a criminal versus civil case. So when we look at child maltreatment in a criminal lens, the perpetrator can be any person. It could be the parent, guardian, or caretaker, but it could be any other person associated, of course, with that child, a neighbor, a grandparent. It could be an aunt and uncle, a teacher. Those harms against children are not included in CPS data. So what type of harm do we record against juvenile victims in the state of South Dakota? DCI annually reports rates of victimization. And in 2018, what was fascinating, something that we actually don't talk about a lot, is that children under the age of 18 had the highest rate of victimization, meaning of all of the victims of harm in the state of South Dakota in 2018, kiddos had the highest rate of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, sexual assault with an object, fondling, and simple assault. So statistically, what does that look like? Well, there were actually 194 instances of rape for children under the age of 18 in the state of South Dakota that we know about in 2018. That's vastly different than Child Protective Service numbers. I point this out because in our state, we don't have one central collection point for data regarding the safety and welfare of our children. We have rich pockets of data that talk about very specific categories of people, but we don't have an overall collection system. A group out of the South Dakota State SDSU, South Dakota State University, compiles a sexual violence data report for the Department of Health. And that report had traditionally been published every year. It was not published in 2020, and it just came out again in March of 2021. But what you're seeing on the screen is our best guesstimate of the age distribution of victims in the state of South Dakota. The yellow line is South Dakota's population. In a perfect world, there would be no victimization happening in our state. But of course, we don't live in a perfect world. So statistically, the next perfect scenario would be equal percentage of victims for the rate of population, meaning the blue and the yellow lines would match. Unfortunately, what you're seeing when we look at the blue line on your screen, you're gonna look to the far left where it says under the age of 18. In the state of South Dakota, almost 45% of victims of forcible rape are under the age of 18. If you are dealing with sexual violence in the state of South Dakota, you are dealing with children. You must know how to interact with our kiddos. You must know how to help create safety, because children who are harmed without a pathway to resilience will become adults that are involved in the criminal justice system, adults that are experiencing traumatic stress and the results of traumatic stress, and adults that are dying much, much earlier than necessary. Let's talk about the perpetrators. Once again, in our state, we must be mindful that the highest rate of sexual violence is actually coming from our children. If you see on your screen here, the highest rate of perpetrators is they're people under the age of 24. It's at times referred to as common information that the brain does not stop growing, does not stop expanding and maturing until the age of 25. We have perpetrators who are harming children, and at times they may be harming children as a result of their own trauma and their own victimization. So as we move into the next portion of this presentation today, I want to be mindful that when we talk about trauma-informed practices within the courtroom and we start talking about how we treat our victims, we need to be mindful that that also means how are we treating the defendants? Because if we're dealing with people under the age of 25, we're dealing with perpetrators who are youthful. There are ways that we can create safety where we can hold the perpetrator accountable, but provide for resilience for that perpetrator to move into healing and to become a more productive member of society. One more thing I must point out, that this information, once again, does not include information from our Native nations. This is, it's no one agency's fault. It's not the tribal nation's fault. It is just the reality that we should do better in our state about collecting information about what's happening, and just being mindful that one snapshot of picture does not, one snapshot of data does not give us the whole picture of the health and welfare of our children or the people that we're going to be talking about. When we look at statistics of the demographics and the racial makeup of victims and offenders, there is a higher rate of victimization amongst our Native American neighbors, our Native American family members. However, please be mindful that when we talk about adversity in childhood and we talk about trauma, our trauma has no socioeconomic boundary. It has no racial divide. It has no zip code. It can happen in any family. When we looked at the CDC Kaiser Permanente study of the 17,000 participants, again, the majority of them were Caucasian, were college educated, and it's reflective that adversity happens in all demographics. It happens more to our family and neighbors who are make up minority populations, but the point being that the statistics you're seeing on the screen do not reflect our Native Nation community members in terms of getting information from our reservations in South Dakota. So with all of that heavy information, what can we as a state do? What can we do better to prevent and respond to adversity? Multiple national and worldwide organizations have set up toolkits for community-based responses. And South Dakota has been looking at the CDC connections for ending violence in childhood and also preventing ACEs. The strategies that you see on your screen here, these 6 strategies, were published by the CDC in 2019 as impactful ways for how we can work together to lessen and prevent adversity and trauma in childhood. Where we're going to focus on today is the very last strategy, the intervene to lessen the intermediate harm and the long-term harms of childhood. A trauma-informed court system can assist with identifying children in need of trauma-focused services. we can assist in reducing the re-traumatization of children in courts and defendants and victims and witnesses and jury members within the court system. Once again, we talk about trauma being the result of an exposure to an incident or series of events. If you are seeing a client because they have something bad going on in their life, if you are knowledgeable about these strategies and the impacts of adversity, you may be able to start seeing why your clients are acting the way they are. It's important to be aware that many of the people who before you, who appear before you in the court system remain in harmful environments and relationships. And many of these survivors of trauma will be re-traumatized in the behavioral health and criminal justice systems by having to tell their story over and over again. They may have physiological experiences of being triggered by perhaps a smell, a sound, a word choice that recreates or recalls the original abuse. When you begin learning more about the impact of ACEs, and we studied the neurobiology, we will see that the fight, flight, or freeze responses that are triggered because of our coping mechanisms for a trauma, if those fight, flight, or freeze responses are triggered, for example, in a defendant, as they are sitting there and a judge is talking to that defendant, you might see the defendant starting to act in a way that is inappropriate for that specific situation, and it has nothing to do with what is happening in the room. It could be a triggering moment that's taking the defendant back to a prior traumatization, and all of a sudden you have a person who is acting aggressively. You have a person who maybe is frozen in their coping mechanism and their response, and they may not be able to answer a judge's questions or answer the defense attorney or their attorney in an appropriate way. Very similarly, you may have a witness who freezes on the stand. You may have a witness that has a flat affect or is all of a sudden unable to recall a scenario. And it's not a personal characteristic of that witness or that victim. It totally could be a triggering response to the adversity and a re-traumatization of events that happened prior to the day. So the court system has the potential to keep old wounds open and to invoke habits or responses from people that are potentially inappropriate for the moment and can hinder the movement of your case throughout the system. It can also hinder your relationship with your client. So knowing how to create a safe, psychologically and physiologically safe system for witnesses and defendants will actually create physical safety in the courtroom, as well as allow you to move more quickly, more impactfully through a case. One piece that we have not talked about quickly, and I just want to put this in the back of your mind, is because we know trauma in childhood has no boundaries, the majority of your jury members will have some type of adversity in their background. And when we practice in front of a jury, it's important for us to be mindful of how our actions, our words, and our interactions are going to be impacting that jury member at the moment of the trial, but also after the trial. And as we move through some of these processes about how we can create safety within our legal practice, be mindful of how you can also create safety for your witnesses and your jury members. So we talked a little bit about abuse and neglect cases and child abuse cases. What is fascinating is that sometimes as lawyers, we forget about the goals of those cases. In an abuse and neglect case, the goal is to reunify the family. Because the goal is to reunify the family, you as an attorney are going to be treating the mother and father much, much differently in an abuse and neglect case than you would if you were the prosecuting attorney trying to convict them in a criminal case. Also, you as a defense attorney, if you were defending the parent in an abuse and neglect case, because the goal is to reunify that family, it would be completely almost unheard of or inappropriate for you to have a child on the stand, knowing how traumatizing that event can be to have a kiddo come up and testify because you want to create safety for that family. You would be doing everything in your power to help the child and the parent heal and get to a point where they can live together safely. However, if your goal is to hold the perpetrator accountable or to rehabilitate the perpetrator as the prosecutor and as the defense attorney in a criminal case, you're going to try very hard to make sure that the defendant has an appropriate and fair trial. All of a sudden, you may be looking at having a child as a witness on the court stand and treating that child in a psychologically safe way, but all of a sudden, the dynamics of the case shift. Why it's important for us to point that out is because if we are mindful of the goal, then we can be mindful of our actions and how we treat all parties, the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators, the victims or the alleged victims in child abuse and neglect cases. But what's important, which I love to say right now, is that because we are building a community of trauma-informed responders, this is not all on your shoulders. We must be working in a multidisciplinary team to respond to instances of harm to our children. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like in the state of South Dakota. Many of you may have great multidisciplinary teams or child response teams in your community. You may call them CPT teams, court protection teams. You may call them SARTs, or you may call them MDTs or multidisciplinary teams. I'd like to share with you something that's happening up in the Watertown area. The REACH team is a multidisciplinary team made up of law enforcement officers, medical providers, a full-time child protective service worker, mental health providers, prosecutor, and forensic interviewer. What makes this team unique for the state of South Dakota is that they come together at one time and they meet with the family at one location. So a victim of an alleged victim of a harm can go to the Sanford Clinic in Watertown, and there the entire family would meet if depending on the scenario, right? This is all fact specific, but the child and whoever has custody of that child would meet with the team to develop a case plan. That child would tell their story one time, not 3 or 4 different times. So you're not repeating it to a law enforcement officer, a forensic interviewer, a doctor, and your counselor. All of those people are involved with the initial report and the initial the initial interview in a way that you get your information one time from your kiddo. And because they're working together to create a safety plan, that family has the ability to begin the healing process and understand how to work through the court system. We have many multidisciplinary teams, again, happening across the state. This one is unique in how they function. The other thing that is really fascinating about the REACH team is that the REACH team is a regional approach. It's my understanding that all instances of harm in a 13-county radius go to this REACH team. Now, that took a lot of patience, a lot of work through MOUs between different agencies and understanding jurisdictional boundaries and trusting the REACH team to be your resource for going through the court process. To tell you how many kiddos these folks are seeing, in the first year of operation in 2018, they saw approximately 120 cases. Of those 120 cases, over 100 of them were sexual assault allegations. So that is a good example of how a MDT team can function in South Dakota. Please know that the MDT team has the ability to come do trainings for you and your jurisdiction at any time to talk about building stronger teams. Took a look here at the time, and I'm realizing that I'm running a little short, so I'll talk a little faster here. Another program that I'd like to lift up is out of the Rapid City area. In Rapid City, they're implementing a program called Handle with Care. And what Handle with Care is an agreement between the law enforcement agencies in the Rapid City area and the school systems, that if law enforcement comes into contact with a child, law enforcement agency will contact the school, not telling the school anything about the case, but just saying that the child, there was a child who a child who had contact with a law enforcement officer. So that could be a car accident, it could be a response to domestic violence, it could be a drug issue or an alcohol issue or a suicide attempt. But whatever that may be, the hope is to be alerting the school to handle that child with care and in a trauma-informed and sensitive way the next day. So if the child is presenting as sleepy or defiant or hyperactive, knowing that those responses could be the psychological or physiological responses to adversity, and that child is dealing with a harm. It's a very, very cool system. Many states have implemented this, and I applaud the Rapid City area for bringing this to South Dakota. Other projects on here, of course, are the sexual assault response teams, or the SARTs, and the Lutheran Social Services school intervention programs that are connecting law enforcement officers with case managers and other programs throughout state to help with that case management of kiddos going through the system. So what can you do as an attorney? First of all, let's talk about identifying the trauma. Is there a way for you as an attorney to implement a screening mechanism that allows you to recognize that a client may be facing a trauma? Something I haven't said yet, but I need to be clear about this. Not all people who experience trauma, or not all kiddos who experience trauma, are going to have negative outcomes. They just have a higher likelihood of having the potential for negative outcomes. And because of that, being mindful of it, we can adjust our practices, and we can absolutely help connect our clients with resources. Another piece that you will see in the presentation materials, Beth will post some information for us on the State Bar website. The Supreme Court of Ohio has a screening tool that they use in their juvenile cases that help identify the trauma and help identify how we can connect with resources. And what's so important about these screening tools aren't necessarily saying what it was the exact trauma that happened to you, but understanding a client's reaction to current events might have nothing to do with the current events and so much more to do with the past trauma. So screening mechanisms, you'll have some screening tools available on State Bar website. Another thing is adjusting our relationships and looking at the power strategies and the power dynamics between attorneys, between the judge, and addressing the fact that when we respect others, while we're holding people accountable but are respecting others, it can create reactions in people that help with the safety and the process of our court systems. I just think it's fascinating to learn about how much just respecting a person who's going through the court system will make a difference in how they interact with the judicial system. Another thing is adapting legal strategies and building those partnerships, those multidisciplinary team areas of work. How are you working with your defense attorney if there's a child witness? Is there a way that you could help connect amongst each attorneys? For example, if you're a defense attorney and you're recognizing that a prosecutor is, I hate to say it this way, but maybe routinely asking questions that are harmful to either your clients or to child victims, is there a way that you could work as a bar member to educate the person who's working beside you in a case in a way that they can begin asking questions that are mindful of the trauma-informed process? And then finally, how are we working together to prevent vicarious trauma? And that vicarious trauma is the trauma that you take on as the attorney as you listen over and over again to the facts of a case and working with another person who's experiencing extreme trauma, and it starts becoming a part of how you are acting and interacting as a professional. I have this quote on the slide because it was impactful for me to see how a victim could perceive the actions of the court, what was happening in the courtroom, and how that made a difference in how this particular survivor responded. So in the case in front of you, a victim came into a court proceeding asking for a restraining order, and the judge had the appearance, the physical appearance of the perpetrator, meaning they shared physical characteristics. And at that point, when the victim had to stand up and speak in court, their fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms took place, it took over, and the victim was having a hard time putting together a sentence to articulate something. And the judge's response allowed that victim to proactively move through what was happening in the courtroom. So the next several slides, we're going to talk about ways that we can just shape our language, procedure, and environment in the courtroom to be more trauma-informed. First, communication. Are there ways that we can shift the language that we're using to raise opportunities for engagement? For a person who has experienced trauma or who may still be experiencing violence in their lives, a judge's words can potentially be hurtful or begin the healing process. If our judges and our attorneys can recognize the role that trauma may play in how an individual perceives what the judge says, there are an infinite number of ways that we can shift our vocabulary and our responses that help the survivor of the trauma move through the system. And again, being mindful that this could be a witness, a victim, a defendant, or your colleague. So take a look at some of the communication tactics. These are limitless, but it's a way for us to, again, be trauma informed and trauma sensitive. The next thing that we're going to talk about is procedure. Are there things happening in the courtroom that could be anxiety driving? Much of what takes place in a legal proceeding, even in our treatment courts, can be confusing to someone who's new to the criminal justice system. And the simple act of giving people in the courtroom a clear explanation of what's going on, what's going to happen, that can help alleviate the fear of what's happening next. Many trauma survivors involved with the justice system report that having victims advocates around to help guide them through what's happening and provide some of those gaps in information can help in the healing process. They can share, the victims advocates can share their experiences, share the experiences of other people, and then also connect a victim to resources. But the one that I want to point out here the most in terms of the procedure or the experience, could you imagine if you're a defendant who's being triggered from a past traumatic event, and you have a bailiff standing behind you jiggling their keys, and then all of a sudden you're taken into custody without any warning to you. The attorneys in the room probably knew that this was coming, but without any warning to you, you were handcuffed and taken away. We can see how that could be a moment where the person could react in a way that shows their flight mechanisms, right? They're trying to run, they're trying to fight, flight, kick out, and a way to better control that scenario could have been a clear explanation of what was going to happen next, and having your bailiff be cognizant of their actions and also be trauma informed. The environment, again, we talked a little bit about this as well, but we have a lot of people that will be in the courtroom who are afraid of authority. Are there ways that we can reduce the intimidating factor of the courtroom while still holding a person accountable and maintaining control of the courtroom? And part of that, again, could be just being mindful of, for example, how the signs in your courtroom look to somebody who is experiencing a sign of trauma. Also, be aware that there are times when the behaviors of a client in the courtroom, again, could have nothing to do with what's actually happening, but the chewing of the gum, the jerking of the leg, tapping on the desk, not knowing what type of clothes to wear, all of those things likely have nothing to do with the exact scenario that's playing out, or the exact moment that's happening between a judge and the defendant, and could be a response to trauma experienced prior to that day and to that moment. So we just want to be mindful of that. So what are ways that we as South Dakotans are working to create trauma-informed courtrooms? Work with your multidisciplinary team. Prepare your victims and witnesses for testimony. Have a safety plan for your victims and witnesses where they say, if I start feeling A, B, or C, my response will be what? That way you are prepared ahead of time for how the trauma of the day of that courtroom could impact your victim or your witness. There are tools available for judges to have trauma-sensitive bench cards to remind judges how to move through a trauma-sensitive courtroom and also be mindful of the trauma that your victims and witnesses could be experiencing. And then, of course, I just love the fact that we now allow therapy dogs in for testimony. That was a law that was passed in 2000 and 2020. So please be aware of that. To talk very briefly about what's happening in South Dakota, because I want to leave time for questions. What are we doing to build resilient communities? We're looking at the data, creating better data pictures of what's happening so we can have informed decisions and policies. We are increasing our sexual assault nurse examiners, and our ACEs and resiliency training is really going well. Again, there'll be an ACEs training for attorneys, specific to attorneys, happening May 14th in the Brookings area. We are taking opportunities to train professionals and to change the laws surrounding reporting violence in childhood and reporting child maltreatment and abuse. We are looking at our justice system, lots and lots of trainings coming up for you all, including trainings from the Court Improvement Program Committee. And Sarah, this is my cue for you. In just a moment, I'll have you get on the line and tell us a little bit about what's happening with the Court Improvement Program with Unified Judicial System. Other things happening, of course, are community and professional trainings, including the Child and Adult Advocacy Studies program. It's a graduate certificate program here at the University of South Dakota, and we have plans to move that over to the law school in terms of creating some trauma-informed courses and having our attorneys exit their training from law school with this information in mind so they can build upon it within their career. Sarah, would you like to tell us a little bit about what's happening with the Court Improvement Program?
Hi, thank you, Carrie, for that presentation today. My name is Sarah Kelly, and I am the Court Improvement Program Coordinator for the South Dakota Unified Judicial System. And the Court Improvement Program is tasked with assessing the system's handling of child abuse and neglect cases and making recommendations for improvements to achieve timely, permanent outcome for the children and families. And with the support of the Unified Judicial System, the Court Improvement Program, and the Judicial Branch Education Division provide ongoing training opportunities such as the ACEs, trauma-informed, trauma-responsive courts, as well as vicarious trauma. And this commitment that we have with the UJS is for our court system as a whole, and for all of our collaborative partners such as CPCM, CASA, the Department of Social Services. And we work very closely with Carrie and her staff at CPCM to put on a variety of trainings throughout South Dakota. So if you have any questions or comments regarding any training opportunities or anything related to the Court Improvement Program, you can contact me. I will put my email address and phone number in the chat, so you will have that, and I will just stand by for questions. And thank you all for coming today and hearing the presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. So when we talk about these trainings, what does it actually look like? Every month there'll be a training on trauma-informed care, or how we can help work through the criminal and civil justice systems as attorneys. Again, that'll be monthly virtual trainings. We are also looking to host training at the law school for abuse and neglect cases. And in the fall, we will have our annual Community Response to Child Abuse Conference. That is the last week of September. It'll be a hybrid event, both in Sioux Falls and online, and we will have a specific 4-hour training for abuse and neglect cases during that time. So with that information, I would like to open up the presentation for questions, and would love to hear your feedback on what it could take to make South Dakota a trauma-informed court state.
All right, so at this time, there are no questions in the queue, but one item that I was wondering, Carrie, is the materials that were provided for this CLE will be on the member side of the website. So is there another place where those who are not members of the State Bar can receive those materials?
Absolutely. We can post them to the CPCM website. You see actually our website here on the screen, the www.sdcpcm.com. We also have training sections on our website that talk about investigator training and CPS training and responder training. So we will have those on our website.
Great. And there are no other questions currently in the queue. So we'll give it about 30 seconds in case any of them come in.
Hi, this is Sarah Kelly again. I just posted my email address and phone number in the chat, but it looks like it's only going to organizers and panelists. And I don't see where it can go to participants. Is there something different that I should be doing?
I will put that in the chat for everyone to be able to see.
Okay, thank you.
If you have suggestions on how we can be more impactful in our training, if you have suggestions on things that we can do in the state, or if you'd like to be a part of this process and want to know how you can bring resilient communities to your community, please reach out to CPCM at any time. Again, you see our website here on the screen.
All right, I see no other questions in the queue. So at this time, we can conclude today's presentation. So thank you, Carrie, so much. If those in attendance have additional questions, you are welcome to contact the State Bar at info@sdbar.net, and we will get them directed to our presenter. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation. We'd appreciate if you could complete that and provide us some feedback. On behalf of the State Bar of South Dakota and the CLE Committee, thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.